by Jewish peak bodies who wanted to see racist hate speech criminalised, but that was criticised by the Coalition and the Greens as potentially impacting free speech. Now the Prime Minister announcing he will remove it.
We will only proceed with measures that have the support of the Parliament. The Coalition need to come up with what their position is, because at the moment they're defined by what they're against, but it's not clear what they're for.
Now, the second significant announcement made by the Prime Minister during this press conference relates to gun reform. So earlier this morning, when the Greens stood up for a press conference, they proposed to the Prime Minister that he separate that gun reform legislation from the rest of that hate speech proposal to be its own bill introduced to Parliament that they would then support in full. That's what the Prime Minister has done. So that one...
Albanese backs down on hate speech law after getting absolutely roasted. Picture this: you walk into a room full of people who violently disagree on everything: climate change, tax policy, what constitutes a proper sausage sizzle, and somehow, miraculously, they all turn to you and say in perfect unison, "Mate, that's a terrible idea." That's essentially what just happened to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese with his hate speech law proposal. When the Greens and the Coalition, political enemies who'd probably disagree on whether water is wet, both tell you to bin your legislation, you know you have monumentally stuffed it. And stuff it Albanese did, spectacularly. Quick favor, if you are loving this, hit that subscribe button and smash the notification bell to keep getting latest updates on Australian politics. Thanks if you did. Now back to the show. So let's rewind and figure out how we got to this glorious mess. Albanese's government decided it was time to overhaul Australia's hate speech laws, which have been a political hot potato since the Keating era. Their grand plan? Scrap Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, the provision that allows people to take civil action when they are publicly offended, insulted, humiliated, or intimidated based on race. In its place, they wanted to create a new criminal offense for threatening or inciting hatred based on protected attributes like race, religion, sexuality, and disability. On paper, it sounds like they were trying to modernize.
Billion-dollar national gun buyback scheme will be introduced to Parliament on Tuesday when it returns early from break as a standalone bill that the Greens are set to support.
It is important to deal with customs updates, but also to have the national gun buyback scheme along the model that was implemented after the Port Arthur massacre under John Howard.
So that hate speech bill now, what will that look like? So it will look at proposing to ban hate groups and giving the government power to reject and block visas. So that's what will be proposed on Tuesday with these new amendments proposed by the Prime Minister. Now, also on Monday, a parliamentary inquiry will hand down its recommendations into amendments that could be made to this bill. That's the federal government's last-ditch attempt to get the support of the Coalition and the Greens on this hate speech laws. But as you hear here, the Greens and the Coalition have been widely critical of this proposal.
We will not be party to a legislation which divides communities and people along religion, which can be used to shut down political discourse and the right to protest, and which scapegoats migrants.
We did not see this bill until they announced to the media the draft of it. Anti-Semitism is extreme Islamic behaviour in this country is unacceptable. But what this legislation is doing is clamping down on free speech in ways that will inhibit and be dangerous to our community going forward. And if that's the belief you have, you can't support that.
Jack, the federal government now hoping these changes will be enough to pass through these bills through Parliament on Tuesday.
Certainly some big changes there. Kira Hain, thanks for keeping
things, make protection stronger, cover more ground. In practice, absolute disaster. Complete political catastrophe. The kind of own goal that makes you wonder if anyone in the Prime Minister's office actually thought this through. The backlash was swift, brutal, and came from literally every direction. The Greens went nuclear first, which honestly is not surprising because going nuclear is basically their default setting. But this time, they had legitimate grievances. Senator Maureen Faruqi came out swinging, arguing that removing Section 18C was gutting protections for marginalized communities who rely on civil pathways to seek justice. She pointed out that most people facing racism do not have the resources or desire to launch criminal proceedings. They just want acknowledgement, accountability, and maybe an apology. Taking away that option meant abandoning everyday Australians to fend for themselves against bigotry. Not a great look for a Labour government supposedly committed to social justice. But here is where it gets properly wild. While the Greens were furious about protections being weakened, the coalition was simultaneously losing their minds because they thought the laws were too strong. Opposition leader Peter Dutton rolled out the big guns, calling the proposals Orwellian and warning about government overreach. The coalition argued the criminal provisions were too vague, too broad, and would turn Australia into some dystopian nightmare where you could be arrested for cracking an off-color joke at the pub. Now, Dutton's concerns about freedom of speech might ring a bit hollow coming from someone who has enthusiastically supported all manner of authoritarian legislation in the past, but that is beside the point. The point is, when you have got the left screaming you are not doing enough and the right screaming you are doing too much, you have landed in political no man's land where absolutely nobody is happy. And it was not just the major parties throwing grenades. Legal experts started weighing in, and they were not impressed. The Law Council of Australia raised serious concerns about the vague drafting of the criminal provisions. What exactly constitutes inciting hatred? How do you prove intent? What are the defenses? The legislation was apparently so poorly defined that lawyers were genuinely worried about how courts would interpret it. Civil liberties organizations like Liberty Victoria warned about chilling effects on legitimate speech and debate. Meanwhile, community groups were furious for entirely different reasons. Jewish organizations pointed out that anti-Semitism is surging and the laws needed to be stronger, not restructured. Muslim advocacy groups echoed similar concerns about Islamophobia. Indigenous leaders were absolutely ropeable about potentially losing Section 18C, which had been crucial in cases like Edok versus Bolt, where columnist Andrew Bolt was found to have breached the act with articles about fair-skinned Aboriginal people. That case became a flashpoint in the culture wars, but it also demonstrated that Section 18C actually worked when used appropriately. So Albanese was getting it from all sides. Progressive groups saying he was betraying vulnerable communities. Conservative groups saying he was building a police state. Legal experts saying the legislation was a mess. Community organizations saying it would not actually protect anyone. And the public? Largely confused about what was even being proposed. Brilliant work all around. Truly masterful political management. Now here is where things get even more entertaining. Faced with this absolute avalanche of criticism, Albanese did what any self-preserving politician would do. He backflipped faster than an Olympic gymnast on red cordial. In what can only be described as a tactical retreat disguised as listening to feedback, the Prime Minister announced Labour would keep Section 18C after all. The civil racial vilification pathway would remain intact. No gutting, no removal, no throwing marginalised communities under the political bus. Crisis averted, credibility somewhat salvaged, everyone goes home happy, right? Not quite. Because while Labour backed down on scrapping Section 18C, they are still pushing ahead with new criminal provisions for serious vilification. So we are getting both systems running in parallel, which solves some problems but creates a whole new set of questions about how they will interact, whether they will overlap, and whether this just makes the whole framework more complicated without actually improving anything. The political optics of this backflip are absolutely fascinating. On one hand, you could argue Albanese showed leadership by listening to criticism and adjusting course. That is what good governments are supposed to do: consult,